In January 1865, a woman walked into a New Orleans courtroom and did something that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. She was a formerly enslaved person, recently freed, and she had come to accuse a white woman of kidnapping. The white woman she accused was her former owner's wife. The children who had been taken were her own, and this woman, Rose Herera, would pursue justice for 3 years across international borders, through military tribunals and civilian courts, all the way to the United States State Department and the halls of the Senate. Her story is one of the most remarkable tales of maternal determination in American history, and it reveals a truth that too often gets lost in our understanding of emancipation. Freedom, as Rose Herera discovered, was only the beginning. Justice was another matter entirely. Rose Herera was born into slavery in 1835 in Pointe Coupee Parish, Louisiana. This was cotton and sugar country, deep in the lower Mississippi Valley, where the plantation system had transformed the landscape and the lives of everyone who lived there. By the 1830s, planters in Pointe Coupee had made the transition from tobacco and indigo to cotton and sugar, and the booming parish had a significant black majority. The world Rose grew up in was a Creole world, shaped by French and Spanish colonial legacies, by Catholicism, and by the brutal realities of American slavery. Louisiana's slave system had always been different from the rest of the South. The French Code Noir and Spanish colonial law had created a complex hierarchy of status and color that did not exist in the same way in the English-speaking states. Free people of color had more rights in Louisiana than almost anywhere else in the South, and enslaved people sometimes had more avenues to freedom. But make no mistake, slavery in Louisiana was as brutal and dehumanizing as anywhere in America. We know almost nothing about Rose's earliest years. Her baptismal record offers no surname at birth and no father. This was typical of enslaved people, whose family connections were deliberately obscured by a system that treated them as property rather than persons. What we do know is that Rose was owned by a sugar planter named Octave Leblanc, and in 1853, when Rose was around 18 years old, Leblanc sold his plantation and moved downriver to New Orleans, taking Rose and several other enslaved people with him. New Orleans was a different world from the rural parishes upriver. It was a bustling metropolis of well over 100,000 people, the largest city in the South, a place where the rhythms of slavery operated differently than on the isolated plantations. Urban slavery offered enslaved people somewhat more freedom in their daily lives. They could sometimes hire out their own time, move about the city with relative independence, and build relationships and communities that would have been impossible on a plantation. But the institution remained brutal and dehumanizing, and the city was home to one of the largest slave markets in the country. The move to New Orleans brought Rose into that market. After the Panic of 1857 created financial pressures throughout the economy, Rose's owner sold her and others, including Rose's mother, to pay off stubborn debts. These transactions were meticulously recorded according to the law. The bills of sale can still be found in the notarial archives in New Orleans, among thousands of well-indexed documents that testify to a commerce in humans as routine as it was brutal. Every sale was recorded by a notary. Every transfer of property was documented. The archive holds the receipts of countless human tragedies, each one recorded with the dispassion of an ordinary business transaction. Between 1857 and 1861, Rose was sold 4 times, passed from owner to owner like any other piece of property. Each sale was a trauma, a separation from whatever small stability she had managed to create, a reminder that she had no control over her own life. In 1861, Rose was purchased by James DeHart, a New Orleans dentist. Dentistry was a respectable profession in antebellum America, though not as prestigious as medicine. DeHart had established himself in the city's medical circles and had recently married a woman named Mary. By the time the DeHarts purchased Rose, she already had 2 children, Ernest, who was about 4 years old, and Marie, who was around 2. Under Louisiana law, these children were also the property of whoever owned Rose. The principle that children followed the condition of their mother was fundamental to American slavery. It meant that every child an enslaved woman bore increased her owner's wealth. It meant that the reproductive capacity of enslaved women was itself a form of property that slaveholders exploited. After her sale to the DeHart family, Rose gave birth to another child, Josephine. The father of all these children was a free man of color named George Herera. George worked as a house painter in New Orleans alongside his father. The Herera family was part of New Orleans' substantial free black community, which numbered in the thousands and included people of considerable wealth and education. Free people of color in New Orleans owned property, ran businesses, and created a vibrant culture that would influence American music and art for generations. But their status was always precarious. They could not vote. They faced constant legal restrictions, and their family members could be enslaved. Sometime around 1859 or 1860, George and Rose were married by a Catholic priest in the city. The church that performed the ceremony kept no record of it, because Louisiana law did not recognize marriages involving enslaved people. The marriage had no legal force, but it was real to Rose and George, and it created a family. This marriage reveals something important about the complicated social dynamics of slavery in New Orleans. George was legally free, but Rose was not. Their union existed outside the law, in a space that slavery tried to close but never quite could. The DeHarts, whether through tolerance, indifference, or calculation, allowed this relationship to continue. Perhaps they saw it as a kindness, a way of keeping Rose content and compliant. Perhaps they simply understood that each child Rose had increased their wealth. The children that Rose and George produced belonged not to their parents, but to the DeHarts. Between 1857 and 1864, Rose and George would have 5 children together, and every one of them was born into slavery. The DeHarts were not wealthy slaveholders. They owned no other enslaved people besides Rose and her children. Indeed, they owned little else of significant value. Buying Rose and her children catapulted the DeHarts into masterhood. Rose and her children were their main assets, their investment in a system that seemed permanent and profitable. Unfortunately for the DeHarts, their timing was terrible. Just as they acquired this human property, the political situation was deteriorating rapidly. Abraham Lincoln was elected president in November 1860. Southern states began seceding from the Union. Secession led to war, and war would lead to emancipation. The DeHarts had invested everything in a system that was about to collapse. The Civil War came to New Orleans with shocking speed. In April 1862, Admiral David Farragut's Union fleet ran past the Confederate forts guarding the Mississippi River. Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip had been designed to stop any naval invasion from the Gulf of Mexico, and they were formidable defenses. But Farragut's ships ran past them in the middle of the night, absorbing punishment but pressing forward. By April 25th, the Union fleet had arrived outside New Orleans. The Confederate military commander, General Mansfield Lovell, had only about 3,000 poorly armed troops under his command. Realizing that resistance was useless, he evacuated the city without a fight. On May 1st, General Benjamin Butler led 15,000 Union troops into the city to take command for the remainder of the war. The Union had captured the Confederacy's largest city and most important seaport. It was one of the worst disasters the Confederacy suffered in the Western theater of the war, and it happened less than a year after the conflict began. Union occupation transformed New Orleans in ways that no one could have predicted. General Butler established martial law and began the complicated work of governing a hostile population with a relatively small military force. Butler was a controversial figure, hated by the white population of New Orleans for his strict enforcement of Union authority and his willingness to treat Confederate sympathizers harshly. He became notorious for his General Order No. 28, which declared that any woman who insulted a Union soldier would be treated as a prostitute. The order outraged Southern sensibilities and made Butler infamous throughout the Confederacy. But Butler also cleaned up the city, reduced the threat of yellow fever through improved sanitation, and fed the hungry. And for the city's enslaved population, the Union presence created new possibilities. Enslaved people began fleeing to Union lines almost immediately. Black men began joining the Union Army. The Louisiana Native Guards, one of the first black military units in the Civil War, was formed from the free black community of New Orleans, and soon enslaved men were joining as well. The sight of black men in uniform, carrying weapons, enforcing Union authority, was revolutionary. It overturned the fundamental assumption of the slave system, that black people were meant to be subordinate to whites. But the legal situation remained murky. The Emancipation Proclamation, when Lincoln signed it on January 1, 1863, applied only to slaves residing in rebel-held territory. New Orleans, already under Union control by that date, was explicitly exempted from its provisions. On paper, slavery remained legal in Union-occupied New Orleans. In practice, slavery crumbled anyway through what Lincoln called the friction and abrasion of war, through resistance by enslaved and free people of color working alongside sympathetic Union soldiers. James DeHart could read the signs. As slavery fell apart around him, he decided to salvage what he could. In November 1862, he boarded a ship bound for Havana, Cuba. This was not an unusual choice for Confederate sympathizers with the means to relocate. Cuba remained a Spanish colony where slavery was still legal and would not be abolished until 1886. The island's slave economy attracted slaveholding Southerners who hoped to wait out the war and then return with their property intact. Cuba had imported some 800,000 enslaved Africans over the centuries, twice as many as were shipped to the United States, and it remained one of the last strongholds of slavery in the Western Hemisphere. The sugar plantations of Cuba were worked by enslaved people under conditions that were, if anything, even more brutal than those in the American South. For a slaveholder fleeing the collapse of his world, Cuba offered a refuge where the old order still held. DeHart established himself in Havana's medical circles and began practicing dentistry there. His wife Mary remained behind in New Orleans with Rose and the children, making plans to follow her husband to Cuba. The DeHarts had no intention of leaving Rose behind. Her labor relieved Mary DeHart of the burdens of housework. Her children could soon be made to work, or they could serve as playmates for the DeHarts' own son. If the DeHarts needed money, the children could be hired out or sold. Rose and her children were the DeHarts' most valuable assets, and they intended to take those assets with them to a place where slavery remained secure, beyond freedom's reach. But Rose refused to go. When Mary DeHart pressed her to accompany the family to Cuba, Rose said she was too unwell to travel. The truth was simpler. She understood what the Civil War meant for her future. She understood that going to Cuba would mean perpetual slavery for herself and her children, that she would be taken to a place where the Union Army could not reach her, where emancipation would never come. And she had ties in New Orleans that she refused to abandon: her mother, her husband, George, her community, her hope. As slavery fell apart in New Orleans, Rose dared to assert her own identity as something other than her owner's property and servant. She was a wife, a daughter, a friend. These human ties of family and community endured within slavery and emerged as slavery receded. Rose would not play the role of the faithful slave following her owners into exile. She would not go. What happened next exposed the violence that lay just beneath the surface of the slaveholder-slave relationship. Following an altercation with Mary DeHart's aunt, Rose was accused of assault. According to Rose's later testimony, the aunt had come to her with a coffee pot, and it flew in her face. Rose claimed she did not deliberately hit the woman. She also offered an explanation that speaks to the exhaustion and desperation of her situation. "I was put in jail because I was saucy. I said I had been working all the days and the little babies were crying." Rose was describing a life of endless labor, caring for her own children and serving the DeHart household, with no rest and no respect. Whatever actually happened with the coffee pot, Rose was thrown into parish prison in mid-December 1862 on assault charges. She was imprisoned with her infant son, George, the youngest of her children. While Rose sat in jail, Mary DeHart visited her several times, continuing to pressure her to go to Cuba. Rose continued to refuse. Mary DeHart told Rose that she would be taking Rose's 3 oldest children to Cuba with her. Perhaps this was meant as a threat, a way to coerce Rose into compliance. Perhaps Mary DeHart genuinely did not understand that Rose would resist, but Rose still refused. She was sick, she was in prison, and she would not agree to go to Cuba. And so Mary DeHart made a decision that would haunt both women for years to come. On January 15, 1863, she boarded a steamship bound for Havana with 3 of Rose's children: Ernest, Mary, and Josephine. George Herera, Rose's husband, tried to stop her. Rose's mother tried to stop her. They were both powerless. They were black people in a society that gave them no legal standing to challenge a white woman's actions. Rose, locked in prison with her infant son, could do nothing but receive the devastating news that her children had been taken beyond freedom's reach. It was exactly 2 weeks after President Lincoln had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, a document that did not technically apply to New Orleans, but that symbolized the direction of the war. Rose's children were being carried toward permanent slavery at the very moment that slavery was beginning to die. The cruel irony of the timing could not have been lost on Rose. Freedom was coming, but not for Ernest, Mary, and Josephine. They were being taken to a place where slavery would continue for another 23 years. Rose and her infant son were eventually released from prison, and she rejoined her husband George to begin the long struggle to recover their children. They launched a legal challenge to free their children in Cuba, using whatever resources they could muster. But that struggle would unfold against a backdrop of personal tragedy. In 1864, George Herera died of tuberculosis. Rose was now a widow with 2 small children in New Orleans, and 3 children held in bondage in Cuba. She had lost her husband, her partner in the fight to recover their family. She clung to his Spanish surname, Herera, which would identify her for the rest of her life. It was a way of holding on to him, of maintaining the family identity they had built together despite all the obstacles slavery had placed in their way. The world Rose navigated after George's death was in rapid transformation. General Nathaniel Banks, who had replaced Butler as commander in New Orleans, summoned a constitutional convention in 1864 to write a new constitution for the portions of Louisiana under Union control. The convention met in Liberty Hall, inside Gallier Hall, where 3 years earlier a convention had voted to leave the Union. Louisiana adopted a new state constitution that abolished slavery throughout the state, at least in the portions under Union control. Article 1 declared, "Slavery and involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, are hereby forever abolished and prohibited throughout the state." This constitution was part of President Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction, which called for a state's re-entry into the Union after 10% of its voters swore loyalty to the United States. The 1864 Louisiana Constitution was revolutionary in many ways. It abolished slavery without compensation to slaveholders, established a minimum wage and a 9-hour workday, and provided tax money for public education for both white and black children. But it failed to give black Louisianans full civil or political rights, including the right to vote. Still, the new legal landscape created possibilities that had not existed before. Rose Herera was now legally free. She was a citizen of Louisiana, entitled to the protection of its laws. And in this revolutionary moment, she seized an opportunity. In January 1865, Mary DeHart returned to New Orleans to visit friends. She had been living in Havana with her husband and Rose's children for 2 years. Perhaps she felt confident that the worst was over, that she could travel back to the city without consequences. Perhaps she assumed that no one would challenge her, that the old order still held enough power to protect her. She was wrong. Rose Herera turned the tables on her former mistress. She went to a local judge and made a startling allegation. Mary DeHart had abducted 3 of her children and was holding them in bondage in Cuba. She wanted DeHart prosecuted for kidnapping, and she wanted her children back. In early 1865, a newly freed woman was accusing a white woman of a crime and demanding justice. This was something that would have been impossible just a few years earlier. Under the old slave code, enslaved people could not testify against white people in court. They had no legal standing to bring charges. They were property, not persons. But now Rose was free, and she intended to use her freedom to fight for her children. Rose found a powerful ally in Thomas Jefferson Durant, one of the most prominent lawyers in New Orleans. Durant was born in Philadelphia in 1817 and had moved to New Orleans as a young man. He had become a successful lawyer, a state senator, a United States district attorney, and eventually Attorney General of Louisiana. He was a complicated figure, a Southerner who had briefly served in the Confederate Army, a former secessionist who had been fundamentally changed by the city's early defeat in the Civil War. When Farragut captured New Orleans in 1862, the office of governor was offered to Durant, but he declined it on the grounds that he could not be governor and at the same time be subordinate to military authority. He had become a leader among those who supported the Union cause in Louisiana, working with the military government and advocating for the rights of freed people. Taking a case like Rose Herera's was sure to make Durant unpopular in establishment circles, but he took it anyway. Durant charged James and Mary DeHart with kidnapping 3 children from a city where the slavery laws had become opaque under Union occupation. The legal arguments were complex. Had it been illegal for an owner to take enslaved people out of Louisiana at the time the children were taken? The fact that New Orleans was Union-occupied when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect made this question even more complicated. The proclamation did not apply to New Orleans, but slavery was clearly crumbling there. Louisiana law prohibited enslaved children under the age of 10 from being sold apart from their mothers without consent. Rose consistently claimed that she never gave her consent for her children to be taken. Durant built his case around this provision, arguing that Mary DeHart had violated Louisiana's own slave code. The case went through multiple legal venues. Rose pursued her claims first in civilian courts, and when that failed, in the provost courts of the occupying army. The military government in New Orleans had its own system of justice, separate from the civilian courts, and it was sometimes more sympathetic to the claims of freed people. What was remarkable was not just that Rose was allowed to bring the case at all, but that she was allowed to testify in court against her former mistress. For a black woman to testify against a white woman was itself a revolutionary act, something that overturned one of the fundamental assumptions of the slave system. Rose's voice was being heard in a courtroom, and it was being taken seriously. Mary DeHart's trial took place in April 1865, in the shadows of far more earth-shattering events. The war was ending. General Lee surrendered at Appomattox on April 9th. President Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th. The country was in chaos, mourning its fallen president and trying to figure out what the end of the war would mean. But Rose Herera's case continued, raising the question of whether masters could ever be held accountable for what they had done to their human property. The answer was yes and no. The Union commander in New Orleans, who had the final say in military justice, decided that Mary DeHart could not be found guilty of kidnapping under the law as it existed at the time the children were taken. In 1863, when Mary DeHart had taken the children to Cuba, slavery was still technically legal in New Orleans. Taking enslaved people out of the state was not clearly illegal. But the commander was determined to find her guilty of something. He concluded that Mary DeHart had violated the spirit of Louisiana's own slave code, which prohibited enslaved mothers from being sold apart from their children under the age of 10 without their consent. This was a highly strained and deeply ironic judgment. The commander was using a law designed to regulate slavery, to make it slightly less cruel, to punish a slaveholder for the cruelty she had inflicted. But the judgment was soon reversed by a new, more lenient commander, who allowed Mary DeHart to return to Cuba upon the promise that she would restore the children to their mother. It was a promise that would not be kept for a long time. Mary DeHart returned to Havana, and Rose's children remained there, still in bondage, still beyond freedom's reach. The 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified in December 1865, abolishing slavery throughout the United States. But it could not reach Cuba. Rose's children were in a foreign country, held by people who had no intention of releasing them. Rose Herera did not give up. Her case attracted attention far beyond New Orleans. Durant enlisted the aid of Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts, one of the most famous abolitionists in the country. Sumner had served in the Senate since 1851, a fierce opponent of slavery who had made powerful enemies among Southern politicians. In 1856, he had delivered a speech called The Crime Against Kansas, denouncing the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the senators who had authored it. 2 days later, Congressman Preston Brooks of South Carolina had walked onto the floor of the Senate and beaten Sumner nearly to death with a heavy cane. Sumner was so badly injured that it took him 3 years to recover. His empty desk in the Senate became a symbol of Southern brutality and Northern resistance. He had returned to the Senate in 1859 and had become one of the most powerful advocates for black rights in Congress, pushing Lincoln toward emancipation and fighting for the 13th Amendment. Sumner took up Rose Herera's case and forced the State Department to get involved. By January 1866, Durant was writing directly to Secretary of State William Seward. Seward was one of the most important figures in the Lincoln and Johnson administrations, a former senator from New York who had been Lincoln's chief rival for the Republican presidential nomination in 1860. He had served as Secretary of State throughout the Civil War, managing relations with Britain and France to prevent them from recognizing the Confederacy. He had been one of the targets of the assassination conspiracy that killed Lincoln, stabbed in his bed by Lewis Powell on the same night that John Wilkes Booth shot the president. Seward survived, though he was badly scarred, and he continued to serve as Secretary of State under Andrew Johnson. Now, Durant was appealing to him on behalf of Rose Herera. Her children have now been kept from her for 3 years, Durant wrote on New Year's Day, 1866, and in her name, I earnestly invoke the aid of your department to redress one of the most grievous injuries that the crimes of a departed system have left evidence of. The case had become an international scandal over human trafficking. American citizens had taken children to a foreign country and were holding them in bondage there. The Spanish colonial government in Cuba had some experience with these cases. There had been rumors throughout the war that black people in the South were being kidnapped and sold into slavery in Cuba, and the Senate had investigated these rumors, producing a 46-page report in 1866. The Spanish authorities were somewhat cooperative with American efforts to recover kidnapped people, though their cooperation was inconsistent. Secretary Seward's intervention, combined with the legal proceedings in New Orleans and the attention from Congress, put pressure on the DeHarts that they could not ignore. The diplomatic pressure eventually worked. Finally, on March 17, 1866, more than 3 years after they had been taken, Rose Herera's children were returned to New Orleans. Ernest, Mary, and Josephine had spent 3 years in Cuba, 3 years during which they had lived in bondage in a foreign country, while their mother fought through every legal and political channel available to get them back. It is difficult to imagine what that reunion must have been like. The returning children would have barely remembered their brother George, who was just an infant when they were stolen away. They returned to find their father dead, their mother transformed by grief and struggle, and a new sibling they had never met. Rose had given birth to another child during the years of separation. She was now a poor widow with 5 children to take care of. The children who came back from Cuba had been changed by their experiences in ways that we cannot know. They had lived in a household that was not their own, in a country where they did not speak the language, under conditions of slavery that we can only imagine. Now they were free, and they were home, and their mother had brought them back. Rose Herera largely disappears from the historical record after the reunion with her children. She appears briefly in the 1880 census, her family still largely together 14 years later. We do not know when or how she died. The date of her death, like the date of her birth, is marked as unknown in the historical record. What we do know is that her story was one of countless similar struggles that played out across the South during the years of emancipation and Reconstruction. The Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress to assist formerly enslaved people, received thousands of inquiries from people searching for family members who had been sold away or separated during the chaos of war. Many families searched desperately for loved ones who had been taken to other states or countries. Most of them never found the people they were looking for. Rose Herera was one of the lucky ones, though luck seems like the wrong word for someone who had to fight so hard for so long. Her case reveals something important about what emancipation actually meant. Too often, we think of abolition and emancipation as the same thing, as if freeing enslaved people was a single moment rather than a long and contested process. The Emancipation Proclamation was a military order, not a magic spell. It freed people in territories the Union did not control and left people in bondage in territories the Union did control. The 13th Amendment, ratified in December 1865, abolished slavery throughout the United States, but it could not reach children who had been taken to Cuba, where slavery remained legal until 1886. Freedom came unevenly, inconsistently, contested at every step by people who did not want to let go of the old order. Rose Herera sought more than freedom. She sought justice. Justice meant seeing former owners punished for their misdeeds. It meant reuniting families that had been shredded by slavery. It meant getting paid for years of unrequited toil. It meant gaining civil and political rights. Without justice, Rose Herera could not feel truly free. Her story shows us that emancipation was not an ending, but a beginning. The start of a new struggle for rights and dignity that would continue for generations. Her story also reveals the lengths to which slaveholders would go to hold on to their human property. The DeHarts were not wealthy plantation owners with hundreds of enslaved people. They were middle-class urbanites who owned one enslaved woman and her children. But they were willing to flee to another country, to separate a mother from her children, to hold those children in bondage for years rather than accept that slavery was ending. The determination of slaveholders to preserve their property interests, even in the face of defeat, would shape the course of Reconstruction and the long struggle for black rights that followed. The same mentality that led Mary DeHart to take Rose's children to Cuba would lead white Southerners to create the Black Codes, to found the Ku Klux Klan, to use violence and terror to restore white supremacy. The case also reveals the fragile and contested nature of freedom during Reconstruction. Rose Herera was able to recruit powerful allies, navigate an unfamiliar legal system, and ultimately reunite her family. But her success depended on a particular alignment of circumstances: the presence of Union troops, the willingness of lawyers like Thomas Durant to take unpopular cases, the attention of abolitionist politicians like Charles Sumner, the intervention of the federal government through the State Department. When those conditions changed, as they would during the violent backlash against Reconstruction, the possibilities for black people to pursue justice through legal channels would narrow dramatically. In July 1866, just 4 months after Rose Herera's children returned to New Orleans, a massacre occurred at Mechanics Hall. A convention had been called to reconvene the 1864 Constitutional Convention and push for black voting rights and the disenfranchisement of ex-Confederates. White supremacists were determined to stop it. Police and white mobs attacked the convention, killing more than 40 people, most of them black. Thomas Durant, the lawyer who had championed Rose Herera's case, was nearly among the victims. He had opposed the convention as injudicious and dangerous, fearing exactly this kind of violent response. But he knew the mob's bloodlust could just as easily turn on him. He slipped out of his office, fled to a friend's plantation in nearby Carrollton, jumped on a steamboat heading upriver, and left New Orleans behind. He never returned. He moved to Washington, D.C., where he practiced law until his death in 1882. The violence at Mechanics Hall was a sign of what was to come. Louisiana would become one of the most dangerous places in the South for black people and their white allies. The white supremacist violence that had been held in check by Union occupation would soon be unleashed in full force. The rights that had seemed so promising in the immediate aftermath of the war would be systematically stripped away over the following decades. By the end of the 19th century, Louisiana and other southern states had passed new constitutions and laws designed to disenfranchise black voters, creating the system of segregation and oppression that would last until the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Rose Herera could not have known any of this in March 1866, when she held her children for the first time in 3 years. She could not have known that the brief window of possibility that had allowed her to pursue justice would soon begin to close. What she knew was that she had fought for her children, and she had won. That victory, hard won and incomplete as it was, mattered. Her story deserves to be remembered because it humanizes the history of slavery and emancipation in ways that statistics and generalizations cannot. Behind every number in the census, behind every bill of sale in the archives, there were people like Rose Herera, people who loved their families, who refused to accept their fate, who used whatever tools were available to fight for the people they cared about. The records that survive offer only fragments of her life. Her story was found tucked away in an obscure Senate report, pieced together from sacramental registers, bills of sale, newspaper ads, city directories, court minutes, lawyers' papers, and dead letters in Washington, New Orleans, and Havana. But those fragments reveal a woman of extraordinary determination and resilience. Rosie Herera's story also reminds us that freedom is not a single moment, but a continuous struggle. The abolition of slavery was just the beginning of a long fight for justice that continues to this day. The children who returned from Cuba in 1866 would grow up in a South that was rapidly constructing new forms of racial oppression to replace the old. But they would grow up free, and they would grow up together, and that was something their mother had made possible through 3 years of relentless effort. In histories of slavery, we often hear about people who wanted to be free. Rose Herera wanted more than that. She wanted her children back, and she wanted the people who had taken them to be held accountable. She wanted, in short, what any mother would want. And in the chaotic, violent, possibility-filled years of emancipation, she found a way to get it. Her petition to the United States Congress, submitted on March 4, 1865, still exists in the archives. It is a remarkable document, one of the few places where we can hear something close to Rose Herera's own voice speaking across the centuries. From that single document and the records it generated, historians have reconstructed her world and offered an intimate portrait of her lived experiences. Georgetown University historian Adam Rothman spent years tracking down the scattered pieces of her story, searching archives in the United States and Cuba to piece together what happened to Rose and her children. His work has brought Rose Herera out of obscurity and given her the recognition she deserves. Her voice echoes across more than a century and a half, insisting that her story matters, that her children matter, that justice matters. In a world that treated her as property, Rose Herera insisted on her humanity. She insisted on her rights as a mother. She insisted on accountability for those who had wronged her. That insistence is her legacy, and it speaks to us still. Rose Herera reminds us that ordinary people, armed with nothing but determination and the conviction that they deserved better, could sometimes move mountains. They could force powerful governments to act. They could bring their children home. And their stories, when we take the time to find them, can teach us something profound about what it means to fight for the people we love.